like I had prepared a basic question. Is that okay if I just start there on the
Go ahead.
video?
Go ahead. We can always cut it.
Yeah, I know. I figured out we probably end up doing it. So Greg, when we turned in the first draft of our contribution, which was Electricity, AI, and the Visceral Turn, for the edited collection Rhetoric Before and Beyond Post-Truth, we got some pushback from the editors about how the chapter related to the subject of post-truth, which we clarified in subsequent revisions. In the first paragraph you wrote, here's the post-truth insight of apparatus shift. Consult is to imagination what dialogue is to reason. It supports the intuition, the judgment by attraction or repulsion, just as dialogue supports truth, false reasoning, and religious ritual supports right, wrong behavior in orality. Can you expand on this point for the mapping post-truth across disciplines audience?
Yeah, sure. That's a good reminder. And of course, what interests me most in our title is the notion of the visceral turn, what I want to talk about, but also in the context, I think, of what's really timely about the whole post-truth project is I noticed recently, you and I have talked about this before, that the Atlantic Monthly is very respected. Certainly, I read it. And in the last number of months, three different journalists have gotten onto the theme of not just post-truth, but the post-literate condition, the collapse of reading, the end of reading, these kinds of things. Three different journalists, and all three of them mentioned that wonderful book by Walter Ong, Orality and Literacy, which was a great work of grammatology. Um, And so I thought, this is great. The journalists have finally, in pop culture, has finally picked up the thread leading to electricity, but the journalists haven't gotten past Ong yet. And I think that's published. I forget when that book was published, 70s maybe. Anyway, and so, but then I think they'll pick up the thread of electricity. Uh, and unfortunately, they haven't picked it up yet. So maybe, we can jog their curiosity to go beyond Ong a little bit more and get into electricity. And I mentioned Ong because his notion of secondary orality, influencing McLuhan to the idea of a global village, is that we needed a better term. We needed a term that indicated that what follows the electronic cultures that Ong referred to, it's not secondary anything. It's not digital literacy or something, but it's its own reality, its own metaphysics, apart from and autonomous from and having its own reality, apart from literacy, orality, or even the paleo. So this is an opportunity to clarify that we're in what this post-literate apparatus is. Of course, apparatus is a term to not say just a technology, but also whether we're talking about alphabetic writing or digital technologies, that are also an institution formation and uh, individual identity behaviors. So I want to talk about that related to the visceral turn. And first, to clarify what apparatus theory is, this term apparatus dispositif in French, because it's so important to grammatology. And really, this idea it's a pattern that Plato actually identified in the history of civilization, and he had this notion of the soul in the city, and the idea is that you have the microcosm and the macrocosm, and they mirror one another. Human faculties in the microcosm are mirrored in the macrocosm of the collective institutions of the state. And so we might say that the city, is the soul writ large. Um, and and he identified what he meant by that. So in the body, you have in his hierarchy the head, the heart, and the viscera. So there's our term viscera. And in the state, you have the rulers, the guardians, and the producers or the workers. And this is that microcosm, macrocosm, and they mirror one another. So that's a pretty important insight right there, which is to say that the institutions of the society are projections of the individual faculties of human capability, human virtues. Aristotle identified this continued intellectual virtues as theoria, praxis, and poiesis. And I use the term theopraxis there to put those three together to say that the intellectual virtues in the body all must work together. Immanuel Kant took it up again, 18th century, pure reason, practical reason, and the judgment of taste. One more factor here to see how we're influenced by this in the visceral turn is the history of apparatus. And this goes back also to the 18th century. Giambattista Vico had this notion of this cycle of history. And he's credited with being one of the first to recognize that literacy is not absolute, but it's relative to an historical evolution. Um, so the idea is that each human faculty is augmented, and that individual human potential is projected into an institution, and that institution is hegemonic for a certain historical period until it's fulfilled, and then it passes on to the next. And the sort of motor of history is the evolution of the human faculties, uh, each in turn, each one organizing reality entirely in terms of its own metaphysics, covering in the last 100,000 years, beginning from the Paleolithic and the creation of the family, through orality, the creation of religion, into literacy, creation of science, and now into electricity, beginning in the Industrial Revolution. This is a crucial insight to realize and relativize what's involved in the project of education today, with AI being the apotheosis, of course, of reason and science. I want to talk about that a little more. So, what is the challenge of education after AI as the apotheosis of digital technology, but really the culmination of literacy, a machine of literacy? And our motto, of course, you and I have followed this for a long time from Basho, not to follow in the footsteps of the masters, but to seek what they sought. So our project is not to be curators of Aristotle or of the classical history of literacy, but to do for electricity what the classical Greeks did for alphabetic writing and literacy. Um, and so we know that the historical pattern is what the Greeks did, with alphabetic writing was they invented a new institution, school, and in the process of assimilating the practices of writing, developed individual selfhood. So Socrates is the first self, and understanding that literacy opened, the academy opened a new place, a new order of being within an oral civilization. And in the oral civilization, causality is divine, is caused by God, and the will of God, and the concern of that order is behavior, is right and wrong behavior according to the will of God. And we know that impiety is a terrible crime, and in fact, Socrates was executed for being impious. So you know how serious it was. Um, and his discourse was mythology. So literacy introduces a new metaphysics. And we think about metaphysics here as the operating system of this new reality. The new causal principle in literacy is nature. Physis is discovered by the pre-Socratics, and the laws of this nature are discoverable and describable by mathematics. So mathematics turns out, let's say, if God spoke nature in orality, then the next move is to say, well, what does nature speak? And it turns out that nature speaks mathematics. Aristotle codified in his categories uh, this power of reason that is augmented by alphabetic writing, reasoning, logic, and he defined written discourse, philosophical discourse, as confined to propositional logic. That is to say, propositions has a neutral modality, allows no emotions and counterintuitives and all this. It contains statements that are provable as being true or false. Here we are. This is right at the very nub of true false. And it still survives today in our journalism with the 5 W's we're all familiar with. These are basically Aristotle's categories: who, what, where, when, and why. Like all of those things are provable, true or false. Um, and we want to add to that the invention of the computer as I think of this as an historical bachelor machine. So you take these three inventions over the course of a couple of millennia, and they converge into a piece of equipment. So an apparatus is a desiring machine. It begins as an idea. It begins as a desire. So we have Aristotle's truth tables, because we know he took a syllogism and put in truth tables uh, that are deductively ascertainable whether a statement is true or false just by deduction a priori. So his truth tables, Leibniz's binomial number system, Tesla's logic gate put into an electric switch, and there you have the computer. And so what is the computer? It's the camera of truth. It's like true false at the speed of light. Here it is in a machine, put it in a box, and hand it over to electricity. And this brings to light a further historical pattern um, with apparatus invention. So what's noticeable here is that the technologies of an apparatus are invented in the previous apparatus. So it's orality that invents writing, but they invent it for the purposes of of business records, and they hand it over to literacy, which gives it an entirely new and unforeseen use in scientific reason. Similarly, so then literacy, through its scientific technologies, invents the computer for the purposes of science, of course, and it's all numbers, zero, it's mathematical machine, turns it over to electricity, which takes a visceral turn and finds a completely new use and application for the computer, which brings us to electricity to articulate what that is in the new mission of education after AI. Um, so the first lesson in thinking about digital reality um, is that it's not literacy at all. It's not true. It's not concerned with true false. It's not orality. It's not concerned with right and wrong behavior. It's not paleo either, even which is concerned with survival, life and death, um, back in the hunter-gatherer era. Uh, but rather, it's focused on a new, further human faculty, um, which is the visceral faculty of sensation, which is the basis of aesthetic capability.